Hi, and welcome to Cúirt. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Sasha Doyle, Director of the Cúirt International Festival of Literature, and I'm really excited to be introducing you to our first ever digital festival. I hope you enjoyed this event, and if you do, why not take a moment to see what else we have in store online at cúirt.ie. All our events will be broadcast live until the 25th of April, but if you want to watch or listen again, you can find them all online on our website, our SoundCloud, or our YouTube channel. Please feel free to join the conversation on social media. We'll be using the hashtag Cúirt2020 across Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram throughout the weekend. If you'd like to make a donation to support Cúirt, you can do so at cúirt.ie/support us. And after the event, we'll be sending out a post-event survey and would be very grateful if you were able to fill this in. We can't be there with you, but we hope we can bring a little of the Cúirt spirit to you wherever you are in the world. Thank you.
Well, you're all very welcome. I'm Sophie Gorman, and isn't it great to see a festival think so laterally and to create its own instant archive? So big thank you to Cúirt and its brand new director, Sasha Doyle, for bringing us all together from our homes on this Saturday lunchtime. I'm delighted to present to you Rob Doyle. Rob is an Irish writer, editor, journalist, critic. He's also something of a peripatetic meanderer, indeed a bit of a vagabond. His debut novel, Here Are the Young Men, was published in 2014 by Lilliput Press and Bloomsbury. It was selected as one of Hot Press magazine's 20 greatest Irish novels from 1916 to 2016 and has been made into a film. It was also shortlisted in the Best Newcomer category for the Bord Gáis Irish Book Awards that year. This is The Ritual, a collection of short stories, was published in 2016 to much acclaim. Rob is the editor of the anthology The Other Irish Tradition and the literary criticism work In This Skull Hotel Where I Never Sleep. He writes fiction and criticism and essays for many publications and journals, and he lives between Ireland, Rosslare specifically, and Germany, Berlin specifically, and France, Paris specifically, though if this new book is to be believed, the idea of home is less concrete for Rob. His third book, Threshold, was published in January by Bloomsbury. Hello, Rob.
Hello, Sophie.
I'm going to address the elephant in the room in that we are not in the room with the audience, as it would be so lovely to be on this Saturday afternoon in Galway. We are all in our own rooms. How are you finding lockdown?
Honestly, I'm thriving in lockdown, to be frank about it. You know, I know there's a very bleak situation going on for lots of people and for everybody, but on the personal level, I'm in a good situation. You know, I'm in a, like physically, geographically, I'm in a good place. But also, I've been writing like a beast during lockdown. I've been powering through another work, let's say, touch wood. You know, I've been using the time. My life hasn't really changed that much in lockdown. It's just you're all living the way I'm usually living. So you all get a taste of my misery and wretchedness for a while.
I suppose that you would, though, normally, you've just brought out a new book, and obviously normally right today you would be in Galway, so it must have changed plans for you. You weren't planning to spend, you're in Rosslare right now, but you weren't planning to spend the time there now.
No, I mean, yeah, there have been lots of very real kind of unfortunate consequences. I mean, right before Cúirt, I was supposed to be in Paris, where you live. I was supposed to take the ferry over and stay at Shakespeare & Co., the bookshop, for a while and record a podcast there. And then with the book coming out in the States, it came out just at the end of March, you know, the first time in US history when all the bookshops have closed was my opportunity to make a big splash in the US. So it went out there to much publicity and acclaim, and no one could buy the goddamn thing. So yeah, and then I was supposed to be going to California actually for festivals there and for I was going to do an event with Rachel Kushner in LA, and all of that, of course, has been cancelled. So yeah, you know, but like the way I look at it is, at least I'm not a musician. I think they've got it worse than writers because, you know, going to festivals is great, and meeting people and, you know, people buying your books and so on. But it's kind of a secondary part of the job, you know, the main part being staying at home and writing. Whereas I think if you're something like a musician or an actor, a stage actor, you're probably in a far more unhappy situation in that your kind of work, your primary work, is being out there with people, with crowds, and so on. So yeah, it has changed things, but I'm trying to put a brave face on it.
But it's interesting
Which
that
is
it's
not so
obviously it's tapped into something in your personality, because I know a lot of writers and creatives who, like myself, actually have felt somewhat almost paralyzed by anxiety that we're not creating. So it's interesting that, curiously for you, it's opened you up, that you feel this is a moment of creativity.
Yeah, well, it was that, and that I just kind of had an idea that I wanted to work on anyway. And so I probably would have been working away anyway. It's just the fact that there's this absolute lack of obligations, you know. I kind of realized that usually when I'm in the midst of work, I would kind of have all these obligations that keep getting in the way, and I would assume that they're necessary, seeing people, you know, and it's all that necessary as much as I thought. And so I've just been kind of working for about 4 weeks or however long lockdown has been on. I've been kind of just going at it flat out every day. So it's more just about the focus and just the energy of not having to be in the world. I'm not really great at being in the world often. I'm more of the solitary weirdo type. You know, I kind of get my energy from. I recharge from being alone, rather than I think some people recharge their energies by being around people. I like being around people, but I recharge by being alone. So I'm full of energy now, and you're bearing the brunt of it because I've nobody to talk to. I'm not gonna shut up for the next hour.
Well, that's all right. That's all right. I think to give people an idea of not necessarily who you are, but maybe, I think we should hear a little bit from your new book, Threshold. Can you set up the first piece that you're going to read?
Yeah, sure. So Threshold, it's divided between, there are kind of 11 chapters, sections, they are records or, accounts of trips, voyages, journeys, obsessions. They're set in various places and cities. And this narrator, this Rob, who kind of is and isn't me, like it's some persona of myself, let's say, is kind of wandering through the world, having crisis after crisis and so on. But in between these main sections, there are kind of epistolary interstitial sections, a kind of correspondence, letters or emails to an unseen figure who we kind of gradually learn about as the book progresses. We learn that she's a writer too, somewhat older, and this kind of thing. So I'm just going to read from one of those. Yeah. Maybe the afterlife is like this, like Paris in the autumn. The last time I met Ellie in a bar at the top of the Parc de Belleville overlooking the city, I admitted to her how intoxicated I was with Paris. She, having lived here for 10 years, replied that it was her mission to disenchant people like me and point out all that is stifling and regressive in Paris and in French culture generally. No doubt she was right, and what I'm enamored of is superficial, but only in the way that the initial months of falling in love with somebody are superficial. The experience doesn't show you what isn't there, but rather what you might never see again so vividly, as it gets muddied beneath layers of habit and ambivalence. You're wrong about drug culture. I've known women with an attraction to drugs equal to my own. I don't take drugs anywhere near as frequently as I used to, though there are periods when this is not true. Last summer in Dublin, I got locked into a prolonged binge involving psychedelics and modafinil. I used the modafinil to work. When it wore off in the evenings, it triggered fits of anxiety that necessitated alcohol. It fucked with my sleep too. Remember, we kept chatting late into the night and I couldn't wind down. And I was stuck in a frazzled, eye-twitching state that required increasing quantities of modafinil if I was to keep working, a vicious circle. I was staying in my friend Matt's flat in East Wall. There was a balcony and an Indian takeaway downstairs. Friends stayed over for days on end, and the flat became spectral and sordid. No one sleeping, dishes piling up in the sink, lines being snorted off all surfaces. There were incense sticks and Buddha statues, and a huge cloth-bound edition of Carl Jung's The Red Book. There seemed to be a terror attack every day somewhere in the world. France, Germany, America. We would go down in the morning to buy alcohol and tobacco and read headlines announcing new atrocities. When the fog lifted, I found I had a different girlfriend. In the midst of all that, I had a panic attack when I started wondering, what if death is no oblivion and we are locked into existence, round after round of anguish and bewilderment? But maybe I'm repeating myself. I slept terribly last night. I worked too late and drank too much coffee and was able to turn off the awful thoughts even with a tumbler of vodka. I masturbated twice in the manner of torture victims who wish to wear themselves out before the next ordeal. The Valium helped before it ran out. I owe you. It would be fun if you were here. Although if you were, who could I write to? It would be nice to drink red wine until everything was a blur, then wander the streets at dawn. I read your story, by the way, and thought I recognized the man, which made me think I should keep my distance. Most days I hang around by the canal, the cafes. I'm spending more money than is coming in, as usual. Often I feel I'm not writing or reading enough, that work proceeds too slowly. But then something clears and I realize it's going at exactly the pace it needs to. Says the Tao Te Ching, nature never hurries, yet everything gets done.
Well, as is necessary after reading, I am the full audience. It is strange to be in a place and not have an audience clap after reading, so we will presume everyone is in their living rooms having lunch and clapping.
In my mind, the applause is resounding. I can hear it ringing on and on.
You mentioned in your introduction to that, Rob, and this sounds like quite an existential question, but you mentioned that the main narrator of the entire book is indeed called Rob. You haven't tried to disguise it terribly much. So, Rob, how much are you willing to admit you are Rob?
Well, I am and I am, you know. It would be, I think it would be disingenuous to say, on the one hand, it would be disingenuous to say that it's just a straightforward work of nonfiction about me, because it's just not true. Likewise, you know, it would be disingenuous to say that it's not completely, or it's not massively weighted with kind of candid autobiographical confession and so forth. But you know, the narrator is definitely me to a very large extent, you know. But I think as soon as you put anything into between the covers of a book, you know, it has its own integrity, its own life, its own being, and you can kind of become a bit of an experimental version of yourself. You know, you can play around with irony. You can say things that you mean maybe 80%, but you don't mean 100%, and you can kind of play around like that. And you know, there's just stuff in it that's more, I would say, as with kind of every novel, everything in the book in some sense is true, but whether or not it's literally true is another question, is another story.
I think there are many versions of the truth, yeah. So we all have our own truths, and then there are other truths.
And but what I also mean is that, you know, the book is not necessarily pretending that everything in it happened or happened exactly the way it did. You know, it kind of frankly admits that may not be the case, but everything that happens in it is somehow an honest and truthful description of the narrator's imaginative consciousness, or the author's imaginative consciousness, as it drifts through the world, through Europe, through all of these cities and coasts and towns.
I was thinking of, well, there are many writers it made me think of, but there's kind of elements of the Rob in the book and possibly the Rob in the life. I'll try and deal with them as vaguely separate people. But it made me think, obviously, of people like, of autofiction, of people like Knausgaard. And in a way, actually, I was thinking a lot of Edward St. Aubin and his Patrick Melrose, because there are certain parallels with the lives. And also, for example, the Rob in the book could be very much a kind of a Henry Miller character of this. It's a person, a literary, and somebody with very strong literary and also narcotic ambitions, and the two intertwine. And there's a lot of self-destruction on the way, and it's always, all the time, while it might seem very romantic and idealized, there are lots of women who come and go, but behind it all, there's a lot of self-destruction, and it's like you're trying to escape something because you're frightened of actually sitting down with something real.
Yeah.
Does that ring some bells in terms of, like, you would connect with that idea of autofiction, of maybe trying to escape something?
Well, two parts of it. I mean, first of all, the vast majority of what you said, absolutely rings true, and it's a very fair description of it. The only thing is the term autofiction. I never got along with it. I never really liked it. It kind of, a lot of the writing I've always been into has trended towards autobiography. Be it explicitly or be it more through the apparatus of fiction, like you mentioned, the Edward St. Aubin's, Patrick Melrose novels, exquisite novels, which use, I guess, the structures of the conventional English fictional novel to channel material, which is very extremely painfully autobiographical. But my point is that so this autofiction, it just feels to me like this kind of phrase that's popped up in the last few years. I mean, I know the French have had that phrase since the 70s. And so to them, I think it's a bit passé. When the Anglophone world is suddenly talking over the last 5, 6, 7 years about autofiction, the French are kind of smoking, saying, we're over that 20 years. So it's more, it's not that I think I'm any more self-obsessed than anybody else or anything like that, but the autobiographical approach in general has always been of great interest to me, and using one's self and one's experiences, one's own perceptions as the kind of primary means by which you filter and process your understanding of the world, and that's the thing. Even though it's a book that uses the self as its chief kind of narrative vehicle, myself in a sense, it's also a book that is completely wide open to not just the world, but in a sense to the universe, the cosmos. By the end of it, we go out into some fairly kind of out there places. But the thing about wanting to escape and the self-destruction, absolutely. I think so there's this kind of dichotomy where on one hand, I think it's a book that's quite jokey and funny, and there's lots of kind of playfulness and trickery and humor. But on the other hand, it's a book that very much expresses, reflects a crisis and a sense of kind of personal catastrophe, personal disaster, personal disintegration. And though there are these various highs in it that you refer to, be it, you know, drug highs or creative highs or romantic highs. It's very much about somebody in a state of extreme crisis, in a sense, you know, asking these very, very urgent, very non-abstract theoretical questions. And the book is just those questions kind of working themselves out over the course of, you know, 200 or 300 pages.
It's a funny one, because even though I will admit I have not had some of the experiences that Rob in the book has had, many of them actually, there is something about the character, though, which is so instantly recognizable, this need to just keep escaping. So I think you have certainly succeeded in creating, through this very erudite, literary, drug-taking, sex-obsessed man, you have created someone who is extremely real and recognizable, because I think we either are that person in parts or we certainly know them. So I certainly applaud that. I want to talk to you, Rob, and I'm going to go into this bit. I'm going to go into the third person, because to make sure the police don't come knocking on your door. Rob, we need to talk about drugs, because there are a lot of drugs in this book. And the first chapter actually is called Mushroom. And it intrigued me, because I have to admit, I did not know that magic mushrooms flourished in Phoenix Park. That was an eye-opener for me.
Not many people did. I feel I probably should have kept that with myself.
There are moments of great obsession with drugs of many varieties and levels. Rob in the book is quite encyclopedic about drugs. Did you? I don't know how much you want to say about drugs, but might tell us a bit about mushrooms.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I've no problem talking about drugs. You know, I guess I've never made a secret of it. I think it's part of my own understanding of drugs and my own attitude towards them, is that despite the legal issue of the fact that prohibition still exists, that for so many people, they're just a kind of part of life, adult life, normal life. And the less we kind of talk about them as this kind of outlaw phenomenon, then it's probably the better, you know, the wiser we'll get about them, and the less self-destructive people will be with them, and so on. But actually, you know, drugs is just a big, chunky, loaded term for actually a very diverse, at times completely different, you know, phenomenologically and every way different kind of set of substances. And so the psychedelics, like magic mushrooms, even now, you know, the role of actual, you know, illicit drugs in my life is minimal, to say the least, these days. It's just not something I think that the long fascination with them kind of wore itself out around the time I finished this book. That said, the psychedelic drugs, particularly the plant psychedelics, magic mushrooms, psilocybin mushrooms, as grow in Ireland, ayahuasca, and, you know, the final chapter.
I might just ask you about ayahuasca, because I think, I don't know if everybody knows what ayahuasca is. I know I have a friend, and she's a very intellectual journalist, and she always surprises me, because once every 6 months she goes off and has an ayahuasca plant. She calls it her plant weekend. And the first time, I mean, this is a lady in her 60s, so it just, I don't know, it seemed out of character, but it is a drug that a lot of people take, and I don't know if it is even illegal. You took it originally in South America, in Peru and Colombia. Can you tell us about ayahuasca?
Yeah, absolutely. So a bit like magic mushrooms, that, you know, what I was going to say about all these things in general is that it's not like, you know, cocaine or amphetamine or something where it's just this kind of quite shallow, sometimes very destructive experience. That these things really have something to teach us, and as hippie-ish and flaky as it may sound, with the kind of responsible use of stuff like ayahuasca and magic mushrooms, you really can connect with better potentialities within yourself, and, you know, access something beneficial to oneself, to just a relationship with the world can change. You can wise up a bit with these things. And so ayahuasca is extremely powerful, hallucinogen, extremely powerful psychedelic substance, which in Peru, Colombia, South America is used traditionally and has been for many hundreds of years by Amazonian, shamanic societies, cultures, and I really took a lot of it in Bogota, the Colombian capital, and there, interestingly, it's not the average person kind of on the street sees it as a kind of questionable, dodgy thing, but you'll notice that all the the artists and the kind of intellectual, the intelligentsia are very interested in it. They're the ones who kind of take it, and they take it with real reverence, even though their cultural kind of ancestry would be more European and Spanish. They've kind of realized that these shamanic Amazonian cultures are onto something important with this stuff, and so they would have these ceremonies, kind of like your friend, every 6 months or every few weeks, or some of them I knew were doing it every weekend. And these were professors of philosophy in the university, and well-known musicians and artists and this kind of thing. And all I can say is that it's very challenging. It's like you read a book that really, really puts you through the meat grinder. It's like, I think with ayahuasca and psychedelics in general, sometimes I think of that David Foster Wallace quote, which is, "The truth will set you free, but not until it's finished with you." And it can be a bit like that, where you have this ayahuasca ceremony, and it's very visceral, quite literally. It involves, you're kind of usually given a bucket, and at some stage in the night you're going to vomit in it, because there's this purgatorial kind of thing you go. But you tend to confront a lot of your own fears, demons, torments and stuff. But then, you break through that, and you kind of have all these cascading realizations in the midst of quite overwhelming, hallucinatory splendor. It all sounds, no doubt, lunatic to anyone who hasn't tried these things, but I've found great fascination in them, as the book surely attests.
What I liked as well was that, because obviously there is quite a lot of drugs, and I love that your reasoning of why you took drugs then was so you wouldn't have to take them later. But I liked that that there is, they reveal in this character, Rob, this, obviously it's somebody who's incredibly obsessional, and you apply this obsession equally, because obviously the psychotropics and the hallucinogens, they're all part of some kind of quest to find something in yourself, a spiritual quest, if you will. And then at a later chapter in the book, Rob becomes obsessed with Buddhism, and he manages to completely cold turkey everything, and goes to, of all places, he goes around the East and Asia, traveling in places of great decadence. But he's on a Buddhist quest, and so he switches off, despite being surrounded by all these temptations. He doesn't do anything other than observe very obsessively the Buddhism protocol.
Yeah, I think, and again, let's collapse this question of the narrator and the author, and I won't make too big a deal of separating them, because so much of it, like I say, is just it's true experience. But I've always had an obsessional nature, and that's gotten me into a hell of a lot of trouble in life, more internally than externally. I've been in way too much external trouble of various kinds too, but internally, obsessionality can be kind of life consuming, life ruining. And I feel that, in a sense, the 11 chapters in here are kind of describe the arc of 11 obsessions. They're not all obsessions, but most of them are. And the kind of that kind of progress and the peak, and then the working itself out. And often the working itself out only comes by writing it out of my system. So the chapter that you refer to about Buddhism, that's probably the most verbatim true account in the whole book. There's not all that much ornamentation going on there. That's something that happened in my early 20s. I was coming out of an extremely dark time in life. I mean, a real serious kind of breakdown. And I learned to meditate and learned kind of philosophical fundamentals of Buddhism. And then I would say it became the object of a kind of benign obsession. A kind of healthy obsession, because this was a source of life rather than death. It wasn't a death drive. It was something that I saw, this can really help me. So I'm going to ditch the cigarettes and the coffee and the drugs and the alcohol and just kind of see what this can give me for a couple of years, which I did. And then I kind of drifted out of it. And that chapter is kind of an account of that period. But that chapter follows on another period, another one set in Paris, about the philosopher E.M. Cioran, a kind of Romanian nihilistic aphorist comedian, and that chapter is probably the most obsessional chapter in it. It's about, this Rob is utterly has an almost masochistic fascination with this extremely sinister philosopher's work, and kind of can't read anything else for 2 or 3 years, just this guy's work. Everything else feels kind of anodyne and long-winded. And the only way he can get it out of his system is to write a book about him. So he goes to Paris, just after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and tries to write a book about him. But then, of course, fails to write the book and just writes the chapter about not writing the book. And yet in the writing of that chapter, it very much did, after it, the worst of that kind of demonic obsession with this malevolent Romanian philosopher was weakened. The hold he had over me, the kind of vice-like grip he had me in, was weakened. So often writing is my way of kind of getting myself out of a tight spot.
So you say, for example, you mentioned there about the Buddhism and Emil Cúirt, the Romanian author, and there are many, that is definitely another strong feature of everything. It's driven through all of this. There are authors, many of them who become obsessions to a similar level as anything else that is an obsession in your life. And it's funny because you go on pilgrimages, really, to find where they live, to stand outside their places, to visit the graves. It is really, I mean, I don't know if your parents are Catholic, but it's like somebody's parents going to Lourdes. This is your way of cleansing, of praying, of abluting yourself at the just on the doorstep. I mean, not even necessarily going into the apartments. It's a real voyage that you go on, and it is a true obsession. Do you find that these authors and also the Buddhism that you mentioned earlier, once you're through, are you through, or does anything linger from it? Do you still have any semblance of Buddhism in your life, or once you work through it, is it gone?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I've wondered about that a little bit too. There is, a semblance does remain, but I feel that once I come through the peak of a real fascination or obsession, the peak will never come back. Whether it's a benign or a more destructive one, it tends not to return in such ferocity. I certainly, I don't consider myself a Buddhist in any shape or form, and I don't really meditate, although I do sometimes. It's this kind of resource I can tap into. Meditation is a wonderful practice. I keep telling myself that I'm going to get back to doing it every day sometime. Maybe I will. But even though I don't kind of regard myself as, I feel that what I saw of it, it left me with a a lasting, deep respect for that whole culture, really, that the whole rich philosophy and artistic tradition and ethical system. I still read, actually. I still do read Buddhist texts. I still. I'm a fellow traveler. One of my very closest friends. He's a Buddhist. He lives here in Wexford. He's an ordained member of the Buddhist order. But yeah, I tend to kind of get the most fanatical peak out of my system by writing something, or just by going into something to the utmost, and then kind of seeing what's still there after the smoke and ruin, the smoke clears.
I want to get to your second reading, but before that, I want to give you a chance to redeem yourself a little bit, because in the book, Rob, I did notice that there was a distinct lack of any female authors in your obsessions. There was a long list of male, predominantly European, not even English language, but mainly male authors. Would you like to just this is your moment, give us who are the female authors that have inspired you?
I mean, there are plenty. I mean, it's totally fair. It's an absolutely fair point about the book, and to be honest about my my kind of inclinations in general. The writers who probably did shape me most were certainly the kind of scary males, or just there were a lot more males. I guess just the themes and the interests that concern me. I'm always trying to figure out what it is to be a man, and all of the bullshit and torment that comes with that, so they've kind of helped me. That said, some of the female authors who these days, I would say somebody like, Rachel Kushner, who I mentioned earlier, is one of the great contemporary novelists, particularly her last two books, The Mars Room and The Flamethrowers. But also Svetlana Alexievich has been a big one for me in the last few years. I don't know if you've read her, but the Nobel Prize winner, she kind of, for me, she kind of brought everything that I loved growing up about the Russian literature of the 19th century, the classical Russian literature, that kind of just the grandeur of spirit and the kind of willingness to take a great sense of spiritual urgency and moral anguish into very extreme places. Somehow she brought that forward 100 years and, into this nonfiction form. So she's been of real interest to me. I like a lot of the more autobiographical kind of contemporary female authors. Your Rachel Cusk, Sheila Heti was another one recently. For a while, I really thought I was a big fan of Virginie Despentes, who comes to mind because, I first met yourself in Paris. But I've just read the final part of her trilogy, Vernon Subutex, and it was a bit of a disappointment, to be honest. But yeah.
Well, listen, there are, one of the other themes in the book that I've mentioned in passing is women, and there have been many women certainly in the character Rob's life. Many companions seem easily found, but one of the chapters that I did particularly love was called Tent, and it speaks of an encounter of sorts with a quite fascinating character in Germany, an artist called Nesrin. She clearly had a thing about control. Will you read from the piece about Nesrin?
Sure. So I thought with this piece, I'll read a bit from the beginning of the chapter, which is about Nesrin. And then I thought I would skip right till the end of the chapter. So we're going to skip the whole body of the text. Just to introduce it a bit, the chapter 10 is all about a kind of trip to the Documenta Art Festival in Kassel in Germany. And, this Rob is going there to cover the festival for an art magazine, and but he kind of falls prey to this control freak artist Nesrin. So let's have a listen. Nesrin was a Kurdish artist who claimed to have slept with two of the 9/11 hijackers simultaneously during a trip to America when she was 17, weeks before the men perished in a ball of fire above Manhattan. It was almost certainly a lie, but Nesrin used it as the basis for a video work, Love Collision, which was shown at underground galleries and clubs in nights in Berlin. The work comprised a hardcore porn film in which Nesrin has sex with two men, intercut with footage of cities at night and hedonistic dance parties. The three performers have verses from the Koran inscribed on their bodies, a clear nod to Theo van Gogh's film Submission. I knew all this because my friend Fran told me about Nesrin when he heard I was visiting Kassel to cover the Documenta Festival for an art magazine. Nesrin was living in the city, and Fran thought it worth putting us in touch, even though she was, he wrote in an email, definitely evil, but in an original way. Under no circumstances should I go to bed with her if the possibility arose, he insisted. It would not, repeat not, end well. I replied that there was more than enough scorched earth in my past, and already. Ah yes, he wrote back, scorched earth Rob lives his life like a retreating Nazi. Nesrin was an obscure artist in more senses than one. I read a few descriptions online of works she had exhibited, but no search result divulged what I really wanted to know, what she looked like. I could find no photographs bar a couple of shadowy, indistinct portraits that suggested a slight, dark-haired woman dressed in black. I emailed her and explained that I was a friend of Fran's. I mentioned the dates of my stay in Kassel and said it would be cool to meet up if she had time. 2 days later, Nesrin wrote back that she would rather not meet, but asked if I would be willing to participate in an ongoing artistic production relating to art tourists in Kassel. I wouldn't have to do much, she explained, just follow occasional instructions that she would send by email or text. For the rest of the time, I could go about my visit as normal. Curiosity outweighed wariness. I agreed to take part. Now I'll skip till the end of this chapter. So he's just gone and, investigated the festival and saw all of these grandiose artworks and so on. And then he went out on the sesh on the last day. The following morning, I awoke with a hangover that felt out of all proportion to the amount I had drunk, even though I had drunk a great deal, until I blearily recalled Estefanio thrusting a pill into my fist in some packed, smoky club. The alarm on my phone was going off. I reached out to hit the snooze function, feeling as if a steel rod had been driven through my temples. My laptop was open at the foot of the bed, and Erica Lust porn film paused on the screen. I must have tried to jerk off. In half an hour, I needed to vacate the bedsit. Memories tumbled through my pounding brain. I remembered sharing a joint with a group of black guys, then them hugging me, then Estefanio throwing a punch and falling over. The causal link between these events was obscure. I wondered for a moment if I'd been beaten up, but my body appeared to be intact. The hurt was all inside. My alarm rang again. The day ahead seemed unendurable. Trains and stations, pain and nausea. I turned my belongings inside out in a vain search for ibuprofen. Lying back in my boxers, I snatched up my laptop, minimized the Erica Lust video, and checked my emails. It seemed I had sent no fewer than 7 messages to Nesrin over the course of the night, the latest at 6:23 a.m. I read them through in rising shame. With each message, my self-abasement intensified until the last vestige of dignity was exterminated. Since I had no dignity left, there was no reason not to send her another message now. My train leaves in a few hours. I'll be up on the hill again. Come and fucking meet me. I had just clicked play on the Erica Lust clip when Nesrin replied, the first I'd heard from her since lunchtime the day before. There was no text in the email, just a link to what turned out to be a video. It took me a few seconds to realize what I was looking at. A large mound of severed cocks, 1,000 of them, piled up in a concrete yard. The cocks were twitching, squirting blood, the nerve endings flailing. It could only have been a computer-generated vision, but it looked all too real. I made it to the toilet just as my guts revolted. I clutched the white rim of the bowl as I spewed, spat, groaned. What came out of me was black, evil. I felt I was shitting from my face. Out in the sunlight, with my wheeled suitcase at my side, I still felt like death, like shit, but it wasn't the extravagant pain I had woken to. My train left in 5 hours. Slowly I wheeled my suitcase through the centre of Castile, past whispering installations and cheery tourists who roamed in the Sunday morning calm. In a Turkish shop off Friedrichsplatz, I bought 2 bottles of wine and, although I hadn't smoked in years, a pack of cigarettes. Out in the street, I sent Nesrin one last message, telling her again where I was going. I pulled my suitcase along the pathway that led up from the square through bright gardens to the roof of the city. The hillside was deserted, as calm as a monastery garden. The marble tent looked no less lovely in the daylight. This time it did smell of piss. I chucked my suitcase inside. Then I clambered in too. I sat with my legs folded beneath me in the doorway, looking out over the forest and the autobahn that streaked to the horizon. Some dark brown vomit had dried on my sleeve. The thought of catching the train no longer seemed compelling. In the high morning sun, I opened the first bottle of wine and took a gulp. I felt the liquid pour down my gullet, slosh through my insides to the pit of my stomach. With that first mouthful of wine, I was drunk again, as drunk as I had ever been. I lit a cigarette and thought maybe I'd stay drunk forever.
I have to say, I think that there's something about that chapter of Rob's life that I recognize far too much in, particularly the morning after moment. I think we have all been there, and then the desperate messages. So my sympathies are there for Rob at that moment. Rob, I don't think we have a huge amount of time left, but I just want to ask you, because there is one moment in the book when you're talking about Rob, the character's childhood. And we haven't talked about your childhood at all, so we're going to do this all in a quick nutshell, because I think it's important to kind of give a bit of your background. We know you're from Rosslare, but you describe Rob's...
From Dublin, living in Rosslare.
Oh, sorry, apologies. But you describe in the book that your background is a backwater of banal, misshapen people. Would you like to explain?
Yeah,
particularly as I'm from Dublin. So.
Yeah, well, so am I. You know, I think I have a seemingly unshakable habit of slandering my compatriots in every book I write. It seems it's not something I do deliberately, but I've noticed that in all 3 books I've published so far, there has been a certain amount of self-mockery of the Irish. I don't know. There's no way I can get out of this one without an element of self-damnation. All I can say is I'm probably just a congenital malcontent, and that when I was growing up as a kid, and then particularly as a very angsty, rebellious kind of punk teenager, I had a kind of quite visceral loathing for pretty much everything. And because the everything that was all around me was Ireland and Dublin and Irish culture and Dublin culture, that was what bore the brunt of my animosity, my vitriol. In fairness, for lots of perfectly valid reasons. You know, it was a very it was not an inspiring culture to be around. You know, if you were the kind of working class autodidactic type who wanted to, you know, keep exploring the kind of the riches of culture and art and all that stuff. It was all kind of shitty nightclubs and really, obnoxious FM radio stations playing at all the kind of bullshit jobs that you worked at. That was kind of my experience of growing up, and it probably, I don't. Here I am in Ireland now, and very much happy in lots of ways to be here. So yeah, it's possible that a lot of the, I think a lot of that anger and that kind of condemnation of Ireland was a lot of an expression of my own sense of claustrophobia and my own sense of just wanting a bigger, more expansive life in the world. And having, I'm in my 30s now, and having done all that and, being around the world and seeing so much of life and all of that, I guess I've probably made my peace a lot more with Ireland now, and I don't have that same claustrophobic need to slander it all the time and get away.
You seem, one of the key, obviously, elements in the book is this constant moving, this going a lot of the time to having these different homes, going to Paris, spending considerable time in them all, Paris, Berlin, Ireland, Peru, Sicily. Do you think now at this stage in your life, are you more settled? Have you come to terms with more of who you are? That doesn't sound too psychobabbly.
Yes and no. I'm supposed to be going back to Berlin, in a week or so. I was going to move back there at the end of April, the start of May. To the same flat that I've been living in for the last couple of years. But of course, that's thrown into severe doubt now because of this situation we're all in. And so I would say I still have this attraction to elsewhere, to places other than the place I'm from. At the same time, getting older and having different priorities and different impulses, there's a part of me which is starting to feel a kind of like a growing voice, growing kind of sound in my head saying, slow down and just you can I'm probably wearing myself out a lot of the time by just constant restlessness. It's very inspiring, but I'm starting to think that inspiration now is going to be found somewhere else, something to do with more commitment to just being somewhere for a long time.
Can I ask my final question? I'm just wondering about the new book or the new piece, the thing that you're working on right now. Is it continuing? Yeah. Is there more introspection? Is it continuing in the same bent, or is it a completely different?
It is actually. It's the difference about this one is it's a book of straight non-fiction. It's not kind of playing games between genres, but I think it's kind of formally original. I've no idea whether it'll be of any interest to anybody, but it's a book about books. I guess in that sense, it's kind of almost a companion to this one. But it's a book about the two things which you've mentioned, which would be autobiographical, introspective account, reckoning, and with lots of memories, anecdotes, meditations on travel, on people I've known, places I've been, but that interspersed with kind of accounts of the books in my life that have shaped me or formed me or deformed me, so to speak. So yeah, it's kind of it's just great fun to write at the moment. I think in a real state of joy, creative happiness around it. So, but yeah, it's a kind of mixture of autobiography and literary criticism and travel-y kind of stuff too.
Okay, so we will revisit. So Rob will appear again. Rob will rise again. That's good to hear. I want to say a huge thank you to Rob in Rosslare. If we were together in Galway right now, we would be going probably to the pub for a pint. So we'll have to do that all with the audience another time. But if you want to buy a copy of Threshold, Rob's new book, it's available from the festival partner website, which is Charlie Byrne's website. They have a special Cúirt section where you can buy all of the authors featured. And you can also catch all of the previous interviews that have happened on the Cúirt website over the past few days. And there are more interviews tonight, so definitely watch them. A big thank you to Cúirt for having both of us, and thank you, Rob, for speaking with me today.
Thanks so much, Sophie, and thank you to everybody who tuned in.